Bien. Okay. Thank you so much.
So yes, if you could please put on the screen the PowerPoint presentation that I sent you.
You send it to me? Oh, fine. I don't know if they have it.
If you want, I could share my screen.
Yeah, please.
Not a problem. Hold on.
If you can do that, that would be great.
So, welcome. Sorry for the technical difficulties. This would have been a better example for me to have taken a trip down to Argentina and be there in person. But allow me to begin. So one of the things that we'll be talking about here today is digital identity. And one of the challenges for digital identity is coming up with a definition for it. There was recently a survey done among a number of identity practitioners, thought leaders in the space, where they were asked, what is their definition of digital identity? And ironically, almost everyone had a different definition. So this creates a challenge for the industry when there is a lack of certain agreed upon standards and terms. One of the, one of the more interesting points where everyone generally agrees is there was a paper written by the late Kim Cameron, who worked at Microsoft. This paper was called The 7 Laws of Digital Identity, and it was published in 2005. What Kim stated at the time was he defined digital identity as a set of claims made by one digital subject about itself or another digital subject. Now, the definition of a digital subject was defined as a person or thing represented or existing in a digital realm, which is described or dealt with. And a claim was defined as an assertion of truth or something typically one which is disputed or not in doubt. Now, these important key terms have provided a foundation over the last 15 years that the community has used and built upon. Perhaps the most important aspect, though, of the paper that Kim published back in 2005 were these concepts of the 7 laws of identity. You see them on your screen. And what is amazing is that some of them, such as user control and consent and minimal disclosure, these are some things that today in 2020, we view as taken for granted. These are principles that are well established in the GDPR. But what is amazing is Kim, when he wrote this paper back in 2005, had the foresight to see what these key principles or laws of identity would be. So while people may disagree on the definitions, what is key is to focus on these principles to measure all the solutions. Now, one of the things that is important for people that are first entering into the identity space is to make a distinction between digital identifiers and digital identity. Digital identifiers, an individual could have many identifiers associated with that individual or that business. That could be your passport number, your tax ID, your driver's license, voter registration, or even a domain name. When one looks over at digital identity, it's possible for one to have multiple digital identity persona. As a professional, Mike Pelage is an engineer. I'm an attorney. I'm an ICANN community stakeholder, and I'm a standards contributor. Mike Pelage, as a personal individual, is a husband, a father, and a friend. So this is something that is important to understand the distinctions between these different types of digital identity persona. So going back to Kim's original definition of identity is it is a combination of claims. So the one example that I often use is it's like a bundle of twigs, and all of those twigs assembled together represent that digital identity. One of the things that I think is important, and what I would like to try to leave with the community here today, are a number of things that I think are important to be looking out in the horizon going forward over the next 12 months. One of the things that I think is most notable is the ISO standard on mobile digital driver's license. This was finalized late in 2021, and I think will provide an international standard that potentially has the ability to transform digital identity and create global interoperability. This is standards work that has been going on for many years. There is still more ongoing work, but this is something that a number of states in the U.S., including Florida, where I live, are already moving forward with operational deployment. The next area that I think is very noteworthy is the work that is currently going on in the European Union regarding eIDAS 2.0. As part of the eIDAS 2.0 framework, there is currently a European Union digital identity wallet pilot that will be taking place. Just like the European Union set the global benchmark or gold standard regarding digital identity, I think that the work that the European Union is doing within digital identity and with digital wallets will probably similarly set that global standard. So I think this is something that people want to look at, particularly large multinational companies that will look to build and deploy one solution, not multiple solutions. Another important area is GLIFE. GLIFE is the Global Legal Identity Identifier Foundation. And GLIFE was spun up by the G20 after the 2008 economic meltdown. And what GLIFE does is they provide LEIs, legal identifier information numbers, for legal entities. This is very important. And one of the things that they are going to begin to roll out, they're concluding a pilot now and will be rolling out in 2023, is DLEIs. And this is where individual employees of the corporation will be able to digitally sign and attest to different documentations. Another thing is FIDO2 and passkeys. And finally, there's a lot of important work taking place in open banking, particularly in Canada. And I just want to be mindful to speed up since we started late. The last thing that I want to conclude with here before turning it back to Olga is, while I have discussed many of the basic principles and concepts that someone needs to understand when engaging either a regulator or a technologist or your business team regarding digital identity, I think it is also important at times to try to think outside of the box. I have included a link here on the screen, and this was a keynote that Stephen Wilson gave at this year's Identiverse, and the title of his keynote was Trust in a Post-Identity World. And one of the things that Stephen challenged the attendees, much like I am challenging the attendees at the SSIG, is to think beyond digital identity. Sometimes when you get into definitional arguments over what is a digital identity or a credential or verified this, it's better at times to think of trusted ecosystems and verified data. And I think this concept of trusted ecosystems and verified data is something that you will be hearing from Ruth and some of the work that she is involved in with DIAC. So with this, Olga, I would like to turn it back to you. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
And I will stop sharing.
Can you hear me? In English, in Spanish, in Chinese, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I cannot hear you. You're on mute or something like that.
I can hear you, Olga. Yes.
And it's still, we still have the Spanish channel bothering you or not?
I still have it, but let's just move forward. I will I will deal with the crosstalk. I want to hear Ruth's presentation, and then we can get to the Q&As.
Okay, I go with Ruth now. Ruth, are you there? ¿Estás ahí, Ruth?
Sí.
Ah, gracias, querida. Qué lío esto de las traducciones. ¿Vos qué escuchás ahora, por ejemplo? Chino, japonés.
Te escucho súper lejos, pero bueno, intento.
Pero ¿hay un eco de la traducción o mío el eco?
Are you listening to the translation? Can you hear the translation as well? I'm sorry for the technical problems. This only happens when we have some speakers in English. We had people from 5 different countries in the same panel, and nobody was listening to the translation, but for some kind of technical issue, and we are having this problem. Welcome, Ruth. It's a pleasure to see you all, at least online. We haven't seen face-to-face for many years. We have mentioned digital identity in these last few days a couple of times. And Mike was giving us some ideas, and I have a couple of questions for later. There are some standards and some processes. There is no one standard that is more important than another, but now I'm going to give you the floor so that you can tell us a little bit about your experience with your presentation. Well, thank you, Olga. It's a pleasure to be here. And to be part of this panel. Those who are listening to this, all these presentations are very lucky. Many of us in the past didn't have the pleasure of having this kind of panels, so enjoy the great work that Olga and Adriana are doing, and I want to also send my greetings to Oscar Mesano. Since Michael talked about the fundamental aspects of digital identity, I wanted to share with you an overview of the frameworks and rules as regards digital identity. Probably some of you have listened talking about schemes. I haven't heard it in Spanish, so it's always been used in English, the term. Which I talked about identity trust frameworks. It has to do with specifically a framework that is a set of rules that a community or an ecosystem agrees upon with a specific goal. That framework is based on several resources such as policies, regulations, legislation, international standards such as ISO, or different standards from different organizations, as well as domestic regulations at the national or provincial or federal level, depending on the country leading the framework. So these kind of rules are focused on different areas to provide a framework as regards digital identity and the processes to verify and to verify the identity and to authenticate an individual. So this set of rules are divided in different groups. One has to do with technical requirements or security controls, as some called it, for digital identity services. That is like the core of these kind of frameworks. The rules that the communities or regulators or countries have to offer internet service providers. And that is supplemented with other requirements that have to do with the organizational area and are not only focused on the system verifying the identity, but also to the quality or how the organization dealing with that identity system is handling the security of the system that is offering to its customer. And it's also important to also mention the policies or processes to audit and certify that the companies follow or have a conformity with that framework or regulations. And all these frameworks that I'm going to show you examples about do not have specific technology or do not use specific technology. You can see that in the market there are several technologies supporting identity verification. So these kind of frameworks are kind of neutral as regards the best technology to identify digital identity of an individual. So the most important aspect is that any technology can be certified if it complies with the organizational rules and the identity system. And together with audit and certification, it's important to carry out management risk analysis. This is important to manage identity. Let me give you some examples and how those examples have been changing. I've been working in this since 2014, and I have seen a very positive change and evolution. The decisions that are made sometimes do not have such a positive framework, such as INS at the international level, in which there are different fora with different voices expressed, which I believe is fantastic at the international level. And this kind of industries still can't hear all the voices represented in order to make decisions for a framework that can be used by all parties involved. I hope that sometime we're able to do it. So historically, the ones that started with the guidelines to verify identity were the European Union in the year 1999 with some guidelines, and this had to do mainly with trust services. It was focused on digital signatures, and they started with those guidelines and noticed that it was not very interesting in the market, or digital signatures were not popular in the market. So they started working on regulations in the year 2014, and it's the EIDAS. It includes digital identities and attributes trust framework. So each member state of the Union, the European Union, can have its own system to verify identity of its citizens, and those kind of methods should be notified to the European Union, and after that, when they see that it complies with the EIDAS regulations, it is published. And for example, as a Spanish or Estonian citizen, I have the EIDAS of Spain and Estonia, so I can have access to the electronic system in Spain. And since it is also acknowledged in Sweden, I can also have access to the Sweden registries. So the idea is to have a common framework to see how this method can be implemented in each member state. Nevertheless, the model is not perfect. There are actually many things that should be improved. And as Michael was saying, one of the positive aspects that they are trying to work on has to do with e-wallets, the European e-wallet, and this is going to be a new set of regulations that is going to be following what the market is demanding nowadays, and also a new experience as a user in order to have access to government services. Another of today's leaders, which is the US. And why? Because they have focused on security. Each framework that I am mentioning here is focused on the national needs and has some aspects that are better than the others, but there is no perfect framework. There's actual mutual recognition of this kind of frameworks, but there's still much to be done. The US regulations, which are based on 863, which started in 2011, and it's been evolving. The other version was in 2017, and now they are with release number 4. The US had a huge implementation of these frameworks, and because of that, they realized the problems they had in the framework, and in the last version that they published, although they always paid attention to security, there were things to be improved as regards privacy, so the user could choose, and that it was not by default or done by the provider or the government imposing the regulations, or different kind of aspects that were unsuccessful as regards identifying the different demographics. So they are working on equality and inclusion as well as accessibility. So these improved changes that they are carrying out is what their national ecosystem needs, as well as the international trends or what has worked in other areas in order to include it in their frameworks. We also have the Pan-Canadian framework, which is the one I'm actually working on. It is a framework that is based on the domestic regulations of Canada, as well as other standards, such as the US, the EIDAS. Although it has some domestic specific rules, they also pay attention to ISO standards and the frameworks of other countries and positive aspects of those frameworks. Together with this, another important leader as regards sound regulations and good standards has been Australia. Australia today has legislation that includes not only a framework, but they also include legislation. Some are against it, because it's something that it's quite difficult to achieve. There is no perfect model. And the other framework that is the newest is the UK framework. They had government practices for identifying and verifying identity, as well as authentication, DVD 45 and 44. But this year, they developed this framework. You have the acronym here. And although it is a recent framework, they had more time to consider the other frameworks, so they based their framework in all the previous ones. They took the models from the other countries and followed them. It was also based on different cases, not in something in general, but in some specific cases. For example, for employers, when they choose a candidate, that the candidate submitting is the person that it says it is. So they decided to include those cases in order to promote the framework. And as regards different improvements, all these frameworks are trying to include is to improve privacy in order to protect personal data of users being identified. And after COVID, there's been a lot of fraud and hacking, so they are trying to be more severe as regards the rules that can monitor fraud in the identity verification process in order to protect information in organizations providing this service, and also that the service is accessible to all demographics as well as user-friendly. Also some different demographics, gender and racial issues, equality. These are all very recent topics that I think that are paramount for these frameworks and that should be included so that work for all the different demographics.
And I think my time is up, Olga, right? Okay. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me okay? Good. Yes. What happens with Latin America? Precisely yesterday, there was somebody from the IDB speaking on blockchain. What was his face? Marcos Salense, yeah. He was addressing blockchain on behalf of the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, and he talked about identity theft, and indeed, I took barcodes or QR that nobody understands because nobody can see that. What happened with COVID-19? Was there any progress that was made on vaccination? Mike, can you hear me? Can you hear the translation, Mike? In the English or the Spanish translation? Okay. Escucho tu voz, maravillosa, perfecto. Muy bien, la presentación de Ruth fue muy buena. Tengo dos preguntas.
Canada and United States, I think. This is the first question. And the second one, yesterday we had the representative of the IDB who was in charge of blockchain. And he explained that there was some advances in using blockchain for the COVID vaccines certificates. My experience is that I printed in a paper all my vaccine certificates, and I've been traveling with that over the world. But it was a paper that it was just a trust that the paper was true. And it was true, of course. But anyway, they were not reading the code or any other verification. So about Latin America, what is happening and what happened with the COVID pandemic, if there was some advances of some applications of digital identity related with the vaccine certificates. Whoever wants to start in any language.
Okay. So the translation came back, but I think I was able to piece together. So let me try to answer your question. I think you were talking about how the COVID pandemic created the opportunity, I believe, for the use of blockchain to exchange one's vaccine status. This was one of the use cases that we saw deployed that gained a lot of popularity over the last 2 years. The one thing I would caution about, and this is something that Ruth raised in her presentation, was the important to be technology agnostic. This is very critically important. When you look at the work that Glyph has done, Glyph has a number of different deployments. They actually can deploy to the blockchain or a traditional database. So I think this is something, again, always look at the technical agnostic approach. Otherwise, you potentially may get locked into a technical solution that will limit the ability of the organization to grow and deploy.
Ruth, ¿me escuchas?
Sí. A ver, en temas de...
Yes. In connection with vaccinations or vaccines, applications that people had in Europe, some of them were effective or good, and some of them raised concerns in the way that privacy was managed. As Michael said, indeed, since he came way too fast, there was no regulatory framework or rule that could govern the protection of those users and what would happen with the information of vaccines. And in connection with Latin America and topics under this umbrella, is that some countries have started working along these lines, but to have a regulatory framework like the ones I talked about, that required certain investment and the involvement of all the stakeholders and all the people that are involved by this. Service providers or governmental agencies managing the digital agenda, digital identity, and users that at the end of the day are the reliant parties of these regulatory framework or regulations. There's incipient development, but personally I would like to see further development. However, I understand that some countries place priorities upon other topics and they've been delaying or postponing this, but I believe this is crucial and is increasingly more important and critical for all countries to have this in place and for the ecosystem because it has become popular or relevant. In Latin America, do you have any regional organizations that has led these sort of procedures that probably I'm not aware of or we haven't heard of? Chile and Mexico, I believe so. But they're in the first steps. I mean, they have placed other priorities and they couldn't reach consensus so far. Complex takes time. Further questions for any other questions for Ruth or Mike? Yes, we do have some. Voy a traducir.
Ok, gracias. De verdad que es súper interesante lo que nos
Perdón,
comparte.
Olga, pero el tema es que está el traductor y Michael no te escucha.
I will translate for Mike. I will translate for Mike. I will do the translation of the question, okay? Is that okay, Mike?
Mike, can you hear me? Can you hear me, Mike? Mike, can you hear me? Mike?
So I am hearing the translation.
Yes, can you hear me? No, probably she can do it in Spanish and I will translate it. Hacésela en inglés. My name is Lorenzo Martinez from the Dominican Republic. In some occasion, I was blessed with participating before the UNCITRAL and SENUD, given the new regulations that they have in place for digital trust. And my experience was that even though some countries presuppose the model regulation to implement it is kind of slow for those agencies that they take it as part of the change or transformation towards digital trust. My question is, in your experience, what has happened with this law that has not been in effect so far or applicable? And now with this new law, how do you see this in the future? How easy is it going to be achieved? What is it called? The model law of UNCITRAL is the e-commerce law. Did you get it, Mike?
¿Cómo se dice un citral en inglés? SINUDMI, which is the e-commerce trust law, ¿sí? Que si se implementó a nivel nacional, ¿sí? Esa es la pregunta. So the law has 20 years of that it started, and he's seen some reluctancy from governments in implementing it. So what's your? ¿Y hay una nueva versión ahora? There's a recent new version of this law. He's asking, how do you see this evolving in the near future? Eso.
So this, what law, what specific
It's the law of the e-commerce law. It has 20 years ago.
It's the UNCITRAL model law.
Version now. It is issued by
United Nations Commission on International Trade Law. United Nations Commission on International Trade Law. Commission on International Trade Law.
Okay.
Una de las cosas que es importante, y ahí hice referencia durante
ITU has put out a document on digital identity, and what that particular document talks about is how there is not a one-size-fits-all solution, that digital identity will need to be tailored to each individual country and their specific needs. And I think, I know Ruth, I thought she talked about Estonia in her presentation. There's obviously Aadhaar in India. What is critically important is that the local community and the government work in creating a framework that works for that particular region or country.
Okay.
And just one final thing, just to point out, EIDAS they're revising that. So there was the original EIDAS 1.0. It was deployed, and Europe found out that it was not adopted. It did not work because it was only focused on public use cases. Part of what they are doing as a result of EIDAS 2.0 is they are looking to open that up to make it for both public and private interactions. So my advice is you must constantly revisit the law and figure out whether it is keeping up with the marketplace and serving the needs of both the public as well as the private sector.
Thank you, Mike. I will just make a reference about what you told us about the ITU last year. Él dice, y es verdad, lo presentó en su presentación el año pasado, la ITU, la Unión.
That is true. The ITU has a document, a benchmark document on identity, digital identity for regulators, guidelines for regulators that is very interesting. I remember that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. However, it makes certain recommendations. Either the country takes per se care of this, or they combine it and solve it through institutions. Ruth, do you have any comments on this? It's precisely what Michael has been saying. There's no clear mandate, supranational mandate. The idea is that each country, region, or sub-region, in line with its needs, can identify a certain regulation or regulatory framework and create the rules as much as possible or as robust as possible, because they have inputs from different stakeholders. When they are guidelines, like in the case of Australia, it differs. Actually, the enforcement and the creation of those rules is in line with the needs of every single country for their citizens or for their ecosystem. Now, given the examples I presented, let me tell you that these are the most robust, historically speaking, and because they are comprehensive, because they are blessed with certification. Although there are other projects or initiatives in Europe or in other countries, they do not have certification for those rules. And if we believe that the best thing is to present those rules, but to require certification, because it's not the same a provider saying, yeah, I'll enforce those rules from Europe or from Australia, and then eventually who's going to be responsible for enforcing those rules? I mean, that is enforceable through certification. So these rules that require this integrated area in the rules is what is important. And I'm sure that there are many projects in this regard. Any other thoughts, questions? There's one question here.
From Argentina, about the concept of technology agnostic, which you talked about. Could you amplify a little bit more about that, please?
Did you get the question?
I can hear you, but the translator was...
She was asking about the technology agnostic. If you can amplify that concept a little bit. Can you hear me?
So the question dealt with being agnostic to
Yes.
what was the specific question regarding being agnostic?
En relación a algo especial. If you can clarify a little bit more the general concept of technology agnostic.
Sure. Okay. So one of the things that I think Ruth can hopefully expand upon if I somehow get lost here, so stand by, Ruth. when you look at the identity space today, there are generally three types of identity stacks that solution providers are building upon. There are some that are building on traditional X509 certificates. There is another technology stack that is being built upon blockchain, distributed ledger technology, and the work of the WC3 in DIDs and verifiable claims. The third technology stack that one sees a lot of deployment involves OpenID Connect, OAuth 2, and identity assurance. So those are three different technology stacks that are being used by solution providers to deploy these solutions. What I think is very important from that agnostic standpoint, and this goes to the trust frameworks as well, I have found, and some of the research that I have been focused on, is how the existing DNS infrastructure of the internet can perhaps provide that interoperability level. The DNS already can store X509 certificates with Dane, can handle already deployments with blockchain. There have been one or two registry operators that have already linked a traditional domain name to a blockchain wallet address. And then there, as I said, there's some work being done within the OpenID Foundation right now in connection with OpenID Connect for identity assurance. So this is one of the reasons that I think being agnostic and facilitating interoperability is so important.
Tengo otra pregunta para Ruth.
I have another question for Ruth from Valentina that is in Italy. It's a little bit long. I'm going to read out slowly. Do you believe that ISO and ISC convergence frameworks that are the structure of LSE will help with new guidelines for audits of products that apply AI products to identify things electronically, especially alteration when they alter wrongdoings or digital identities in a wrong way? In connection with audits, the techniques, the most efficient techniques, are those provided by ISO. These are national standards organizations that are widely acclaimed. Then what the audit provides in terms of technology is there's freedom to choose there, and the different frameworks are not part of this discussion because the market is very complex. There are biometric solutions and there are thousands of them in the market. So these frameworks do not approve just one, because there's no one that is 100% verifiable or bulletproof, that is inclusive, protective, and less costly, hyper secured, and at the same time will let me use different devices, so it wouldn't be so much expensive for users. That is why these frameworks provide rules, and then any technology that supports this is okay with them. Notwithstanding the techniques of how this is audited or tested, or how we test the performance of identity systems, will depend on the agreements or the agreed for every framework on the guidelines and the techniques that they have implemented in the identity of validation systems be effective, and that is why there's a whole set of techniques that are being implemented, and all frameworks, or almost all frameworks, seek auditing or testing techniques proposed by ISO 1701, 1601, and other 16,000 something that are digital systems. And that's how they address digital identity together with other digital systems. But that is more or less the balance that we intend to strike. Thank you very much.